it talks about the fact that Frederick Douglass was a former slave, and not only did he educate himself, and he turned out to be one of the best orators in American history. The video talked about how he was one of the advisors to President Lincoln, and that he was actually put on the ballot for a vice president nomination. So he is a very powerful figure in American history, and this speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, is one of his most famous pieces. So the first thing I wanted to point out is the fact that this was delivered on July 5th, 1852. So slavery is still legal. Slaves have not been emancipated until 1863. So he is speaking as a former slave. He was able to garner a lot of popularity and wealth because he was such a poignant speaker, that he was able to buy his freedom before slavery was actually abolished. This was an opportunity that very few African Americans had at the time, being able to buy their own freedom, but he was one of them. So starting off the very beginning of the speech, Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, this for the purpose of this celebration is the 4th of July. So the 4th of July was the day before this, right? So he's asking the people who are listening to think and reflect upon yesterday's events. So the statement of purpose is the 76th celebration of the 4th of July. And just as a reminder, the 4th of July symbolizes freedom. Freedom from the British oppression, freedom from British rule, the birth of America, freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. So I hope that you guys are getting into the habit of annotating as you read, whether you are asked to or not. I hope that you didn't just glance over this notion of Passover to the emancipated people of God as just mumbo jumbo. But if you looked up what Passover is, you should have learned that this is a actual metaphor that he's using. Passover is a Jewish celebration which marks the freedom of Jews as Egyptian slaves. So the Jewish people were slaves at one point. If you're brushed up on your biblical history, then you should already know that the Jews were once slaves. So this is a direct comparison to, or a metaphor to, the current slavery crisis in America. Again, he talks about that this is the 76th anniversary. If you subtract 76 from 1852, you get 1776, which is the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He talks about 70 years and 10 is the allotted time for the individual man. A score is 20 years, so 3 times 20 is 60. Plus 10 is 70, so he's saying the average lifespan of a human is 70 years, but nations number their years by thousands. So even though we are celebrating 76 years, it sounds like a very long time, but also not a long time at the same time, because it's talking about or comparing the average life of a human. There is hope in the thought, and hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. This is one of my favorite lines in this speech. It is juxtaposing something positive with hope, the hope of the future, with something negative. So you do have some negative foreshadowing under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon, right? Horizon meaning off in the distance, dark having a negative connotation, clouds, dark clouds here also having a negative connotation as well. Looking at paragraph 2 is talking about a brief history of American freedom. So this is a little piece of logos or facts. The simple story of it is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. So he's giving the listeners a quick history of how they got to this point. The style and title of your sovereign people in which you now glory was not then born. So sovereign, meaning self-governing people, so people governing themselves, in which you now glory, so something that is now a source of pride, had not yet been born. So we were imprisoned by the rules of the British government. You are under the British crown. In the exercise of its parental prerogatives, and I define prerogative here, which means rights or privileges, in the exercise of its parental rights imposed upon its colonial children, such restraints, burdens, and limitations as, in its mature judgment, it deemed wise, right, and proper. So here he does use another metaphor, comparing Britain to a parent and the USA as its child, which is true. Before the Declaration of Independence, the colonizers of the colonies here in America were, in fact, the children of Britain. They were not free. They still had to adhere to the king, and they were still under British rule, so they had to follow British laws. So he ends paragraph 2 by talking about how the British rule was unfair, limiting, right? Which we know that because we emancipated ourselves. But your fathers, who had not adopted the fashionable idea of this day of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to the wisdom and the justice of some of those burdens and restraints. So infallible being defined as not able to make mistakes or perfect, right? Kind of drawing notion on that this idea of democracy was a fashionable idea, right? It was who had not adopted this idea of democracy yet, that this notion of an infallible government had not yet been born. They went so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust, unreasonable, and oppressive, and altogether such as ought not to be quietly submitted to. So the citizens in America denounced British rule as unfair and oppressive. So for, looking at this from a historical perspective, the cause and effects, right? Cause, the British rule is unjust, so the effect is the separation of the colonies through the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Here he's talking about it as if it just makes perfect sense. If the laws that you are living under are cruel or unfair or oppressive, then the only solution is to remove yourself from the situation, right? So the Declaration of Independence was the removal of oppression. I scarcely need to say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Notice how he keeps saying your fathers, not our or my, right? So he is, in that very subtle way, separating himself because he is African American and he is speaking to a predominantly white crowd, that even though we are the same in a lot of ways, I cannot call them my founding fathers, right? Because of this notion of slavery. And then he ends him talking about the founding fathers by saying, they saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn, yet they persevered. They were not the men to look back. And I really liked this line, they were not the men to look back. Like we're not going to look back on the things that have happened in the past. We're only going to move forward. So that is a very positive line. I talked about how this is pathos, uses strong positive words to describe the bravery of those men who signed the Declaration of Independence. Moving on to paragraph 4, oppression makes wise men mad. I really like this line. Oppression makes wise men mad. Oppression here meaning cruel or unjust treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs. They meaning the American people, the people living in the colonies. They felt themselves victims of grievous wrongs. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of a total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. People who are wise do not like their rights stripped away, right? When people have intelligence behind them, then they are able to understand the wrongs of society, right? If you've been watching Tiger King, which maybe a lot of you have or have not, a huge part of the issues with Tiger King is because Joe Exotic, God love him, was not smart enough to realize that people were taking advantage of him. So there's a quick comparison. The solution to oppression is separation. So when you are able to realize that you are being oppressed, then the solution is to separate yourself. So here he's kind of subtly guiding you towards this idea of emancipation of slavery, right? By saying, just like you guys were oppressed by the British rule, so are the slaves oppressed by American rule. It's the same concept. I really like this quote here. He's talking about the people who are oppressing or cruel to others. He says they hate all changes, but silver, gold, and copper change. So the people who are cruel to others hate all change. They don't like when their situations change or people contradict them or go against them, but the change that they do like is money. So there's a little pun for you. The freedom gained is yours, and you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. So, because their freedom has been earned, because they successfully signed the Declaration of Independence and separated themselves from British rule, they, therefore, can celebrate the 4th of July, right? Because the freedom was gained. Now, here it draws an interesting juxtaposition to African Americans in this time, the slaves in this time, right? They are technically living in America. Many of them, if not all of them, were born in America. So therefore, they should be made American citizens, and they should have the ability to celebrate the 4th of July, right? So for them, the 4th of July is just a reminder of the freedom that they do not have, right? And again, he's not coming right out and saying this, which I think is really intelligent of him, right? Because if he calls out his audience for being oppressors, then he's going to have an angry audience on his hand, right? But because he's so well spoken, he's actually using his diction and his dialogue to persuade the narrative in a different direction, which I really like. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect for the fathers of this republic. The repetition of fellow citizens is ethos. Fellow meaning people in the same position. Douglass is essentially saying that he is one of them, right? African Americans are one and the same with the white man, right? We have the same belief system. We want the same things. We want the ability to pursue a life, liberty, and happiness, right? So we are one and the same in that regard. And then the last two paragraphs, he talks about, or he ends it on, again, the notion of the founding fathers. They were great men too, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less than admiration, right? And here he's kind of pointing out the fact that I really admire what the founding fathers did. However, the founding fathers were also slave owners, right? So here he's also subtly highlighting the hypocrisy of the founding fathers at this time. But he never uses those words, which is so incredibly intelligent of him. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. So that's pathos, right? Those powerful emotional words, patriotism, heroes, right? They loved their country better than their own private interests. And though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor on the cause of their country. In their admiration of liberty, they lost sight of all other interests. They were peace men, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. So because they admired peace, they had to protest this idea of bondage, right? And I really liked that he juxtaposes those two things. He says just because they were peaceful men does not necessarily mean that they're going to roll over on their backs and peacefully submit to oppression. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against oppression. They showed forbearance, but that they knew its limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. And again, he ends on this notion of pathos, and he uses the word bondage here, which means the state of being a slave. He's ending on the notion of slavery, even though slavery has not been mentioned really in this entire thing, right? He's playing on the fact that his audience is intelligent enough to bridge those connections together, right? Just like they were protesting the oppression of the British rule, they should be protesting the oppression of slavery. And again,